Okay, we're back on the record on State versus Loyd. He's present with his attorneys. The state attorney's office is present. We can, when the jury's ready, if we can bring them back in, please. Is it me or is it getting colder in this courtroom? It is freezing in here. It's freezing in here. You're fine. State recognized, presence of the jury. Defense.
Yes.
All right, welcome back, folks. Are you all getting cold in here? Oh, yeah. Okay, yeah. I thought maybe it was me. I'll see if I can do something about the temperature. All right. Thanks. Mr. Linneman, you may call your next witness.
Yes, Shanika Bush.
Yes. You may inquire.
Good morning, ma'am.
Good morning.
Would you introduce yourself to the jury, please?
Shanika Bush,
And where do you live, Ms. Bush?
Orlando, Florida.
How old are you?
43.
What's the age difference between you and Markeith?
A couple of months.
Okay. How are you related?
He's my cousin.
First cousin?
Yes, my first cousin.
What's your mother's name?
Jacqueline McCree.
And she's sisters with his mother?
Yes.
Okay. Can you tell me about your relationship with him growing up?
We had a good relationship. He's my favorite cousin because we both the same age, and in our family we have like pairs, like cousin pairs, who's the same age together. But he's fun. He was always fun, protective, and just full of life.
Did you feel that he protected you while you were growing up?
Yes, he did.
Okay. Were you around him about the time that he was kidnapped?
Yes.
Do you remember that happening?
Yes, I remember after it happened, I remember seeing his face and
Okay.
his head all bruised up and swollen.
And did you notice any change in his behavior after that happened?
Yes, after that happened, he was like more paranoid and not trusting people. He always had like bad headaches afterwards.
Okay. I'm showing you what's been marked as Exhibit W, Exhibit X, Exhibit Y, Exhibit Z. Do you recognize these photographs?
Yes.
Okay. I'll move these into evidence, Judge.
Any objections?
Okay, she's going to put up
Hold
on
on.
this.
In order, X, Y, Z are 10, 11, and 12 defense penalty phase purposes.
We're going to put them up on the screen 1 minute.
There's a W? All right, so that would be, so it's 10, 11, 12, and 13, starting with W.
Okay. Ma'am, I'm showing you what's been marked as Exhibit 10. Who is in that photograph?
Me and Markeith.
And when was that taken, ma'am?
I don't remember exactly when, but it's after he came home from prison.
Okay. Did you visit him in prison?
Yes.
Would you keep in touch with each other?
Yes.
And were there times that a bunch of you as family members would go together to visit him?
Yes.
I'm showing you what's been marked as exhibit number 11. And who is in that photograph, ma'am?
Me, Markeith, and his 2 kids.
Say it again, I'm sorry.
Me, Markeith, and his 2 kids.
And what are his children's name?
Kiana Loyd and Markeith Loyd.
Was this a photograph taken while he was in prison and you were visiting him with his children?
Yes.
And approximately how old was Markeith Jr.?
Looked like he about 10.
And his daughter
And
Kiana?
about 14, maybe.
I'm showing you what's been marked as exhibit number 12.
Just another day at the bowling, the same day at the bowling alley.
Okay, that's you in the photograph with him?
Yes, me and Markeith.
All right, exhibit number 13.
And that's another day at my grandmother's house after he got out of prison, me and my brother and Markeith.
So this is after Markeith got out of prison,
Yes,
and your brother's name is?
Glenn McCree.
Okay. He testified here?
Yes,
Okay. Do you love Markeith?
yes, I do.
Does he love you?
Yes, he does.
Would you visit him in prison?
Yes, I will.
I have no further questions.
Cross?
You lived with the defendant for the first 7, 8 years of your life, right?
Yes, we all live together.
Okay. And the household that you grew up in for that first 7 or 8 years was basically just a regular household, wasn't it?
Yes, sir.
It was a loving household?
Yes, sir.
You never noticed any kind of domestic violence in the house, correct?
No, there was never domestic violence.
You never noticed any kind of abuse in the house, right?
No.
And while you were living there for that first 7 or 8 years, the family was financially stable. You had food on the table, right?
We was living with my grandmothers, yes.
Thank you, ma'am.
Redirect. All right, thank you, ma'am. You're free to go. Call your next witness.
Dr. Michael Maher.
You solemnly swear or swear that the testimony you shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, I do.
You may inquire.
Good morning, doctor.
Morning.
Would you introduce yourself to the members of the jury?
Michael Scott Maher, M-A-H-E-R, M.D.
And what is your profession, doctor?
I am a physician and psychiatrist. I'm licensed to practice medicine in Florida. I have a practice in Tampa.
And what is a psychiatrist, doctor?
A psychiatrist is a specialist MD who has gone through standardized training of 4 years in the areas of psychology and psychiatry and neurology in order to supplement medical education to understand particularly illnesses of the brain, illnesses that especially affect behavior.
And were you hired in this particular case to assist me?
Yes, I was.
Okay, have we worked together before?
Yes, we have.
Were you providing materials that you reviewed?
Yes.
Can you tell me what materials you reviewed?
Yes, I reviewed police reports related to this incident from at least 2 different detectives and other sources. I reviewed some copies of statements made that were related to those police reports. I reviewed some written materials from Markeith Loyd, things that he had written that were relevant to the case and understanding of the case. I also received some information from various sources, including investigators looking into his background, his history prior to the events leading up to this case.
Now, Doctor, it's not unusual in these kind of cases that the defense, because of the serious nature of these cases, hire a team of doctors to assist. Is that right?
It is not unusual. That is correct.
And in this particular case, did you communicate with some of the other doctors?
I did.
Why is that important?
Generally speaking, in this type of case, and in all kinds of cases, clinical cases, as well as cases that involve the legal system, different doctors have different understandings and expertise. They have different training. They have different approaches. They use different methods. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes, it's useful for one doctor to consider, to listen to, consult with another doctor regarding their findings. Sometimes that information can be obtained in a report, but often it's useful for the doctors to have a direct one-to-one conversation.
Okay. So if someone is sick, and they're suffering from cancer, they're in the hospital, many times they will have multiple doctors who have specialized knowledge about medicine that will treat them.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And in this particular case, we had specialized experts that assisted each other in looking at Mr. Loyd, his life, and the circumstances.
That's correct, yes.
Now, do you rely on the others' opinions or information? How does that work?
Generally speaking, I would say, particularly in a legal case, I don't rely on another doctor's opinions. I make a very focused effort to reach my own opinions and conclusions. However, other doctors do develop other information, data, test results, and I might consider those and rely on those in forming my opinions and conclusions.
And in medicine, doctor, is it important to have independent testing to determine the origin of disease or defect?
Very often it is. When we have appropriate testing that can do that, and when there's any question or concern about it, yes, indeed.
And a doctor, besides relying on that particular information, is also looking for symptomology, correct?
Yes.
And history.
Yes.
And records.
Yes.
And observations, behavioral observations that the doctor would make themselves.
All of those things are important, and having a point of view from different doctors can be very valuable.
And sometimes some of that's available to you and sometimes it's not.
That is correct.
Fair?
Yes.
Okay. In this particular case, there was a test that was done by a neuropsychologist, Dr. Sesta, that is a test called the MMPI-2 that showed some particularly important information. Is that right?
Yes.
Can you tell me about what your thoughts on that test is?
The MMPI-2 is a very well-known, long standardized, used for many decades psychological and neuropsychological test that can give clinicians working in a non-legal environment, as well as people working in a legal environment, some good information and comparisons to other groups of people. So it's also a test that can be statistically standardized and can be administered in very standardized circumstances, so that it takes some of the individual variation that one might encounter with a patient out of the mix. It's a test that I use in my office occasionally, that I am familiar with and I'm qualified to use, that I understand, that I've studied. It's a test that other professionals, particularly professionals educated in the psychological area, use, and it's a test that can provide a variety of information, and in this case, a test that particularly provided some information which was of considerable significance to me in light of my clinical, that is, sort of talking and interviewing method on this case.
Okay. So we'll get back to the MMPI-2 in a minute. Let's talk about the process you use to evaluate Mr. Loyd in this particular case, what you did, when you met with him, and what your impressions were.
The primary process that I used in this case is an interaction process, a talking to, listening to, interacting with an individual, saying things to them which may seem like casual conversation, but actually are more directed at particular aspects of their emotional, psychological, neurological capacities. So I use a method of psychiatric interview, history taking, what we call mental status examination, an effort to understand the person's internal mental workings by this interaction process. And that is a process recognized in psychiatry, utilized, taught, trained, tested for psychiatrists. It is, generally speaking, the primary method that psychiatrists use to evaluate, diagnose, and treat individuals in their offices.
And so did you meet with him?
I did.
Okay, and on how many occasions?
On 2 occasions.
Okay, and could you describe your meetings with him, your first meeting, your second meeting, and the information you obtained?
Yes, sort of broadly speaking, I met with him in March of this year, and I met with him again about 2 weeks later. The first meeting, you were present and introduced me. It was important to determine that that is, the defendant understood the nature of the meeting, the circumstances of the meeting, the purpose of my being there, and that he consent to it, which he did. He asked a lot of questions.
And was I present after the introduction?
I'm sorry, no, you were not.
Okay, go ahead.
He asked a lot of questions. He challenged me on a lot of things that I said. He wanted to know what kind of doctor I was. He was cooperative, but had a tendency right from the beginning to sort of want to control the interview and the process and so on. He was also very talkative and had a tendency to go off on tangents, so it was sometimes difficult to focus in a particular subject, a particular part of his history, a particular part of his circumstances, and confirm that he really understood and could be logical and rational about the issues related to that. So it was a challenge to interview him and obtain from him consistent, sensible, logical, what I considered to be reliable information. I did get some information that I considered to be reliable. I spoke to him a total of about 5 hours on 2 occasions, and was able to reach some conclusions from that.
Now, you mentioned that there were irrational tangents. Could you give some examples of those?
Yes, he talked a lot about his history and his relationships with people and where he felt he was in the world, particularly his identity as a black man and growing up as a black man in America, which he identified and told me specifically in the interview, spelled with KK. So he was communicating to me that his use of the word America had special meaning to him. We talked about that ultimately. He connected that in some way later in the interview to the KKK and to the words were something like black men hanging from branches and the lynching history of the Deep South. Now, I could follow that because he was talking about racial issues and so on, but this was all related to my asking him very concrete, mundane questions along the lines of where did you grow up, what was your experience in school, tell me a little bit about your parents. So he had a tendency to go off on that kind of tangent. He also went off on some tangents that were really sort of entirely unrelated to the social or legal circumstances. So tangents about his body, for example, and how his body worked, how his sexuality worked, how his bowels worked, what it meant to him to observe how his body worked. He also went off on what I would call some tangents in explaining the connection between the power structure of society and God and his understanding of how that worked. And a lot of that, frankly, I couldn't really make sense of. He wasn't saying God was a higher power and the authorities had to follow him, or vice versa. It was all mixed together in a way that I found very confusing, even after trying to ask him clarifying questions.
And what was your impression of that communication that you were having with him?
My initial impression was that it was disconnected, disordered, confused, not very logical. After seeing him for a significant period of time, I reached the conclusion that he was suffering from what we in psychiatry describe as a thought disorder or a psychotic thought disorder. People who suffer from thought disorders don't have the ability to consistently and reliably think in a logical, coherent, chronologically connected fashion. So it was my conclusion that his inclination to be so talkative, to go off on tangents, to have a lot of very odd ideas, which if it was just that one idea, might not mean a whole lot, but his whole thinking pattern was characterized by those kinds of very odd, unbelievable ideas. So it was my conclusion that he was suffering from a thought disorder, which is a symptom of psychosis, a symptom of being out of touch with reality.
Is that someone who is clearly mentally ill?
Yes.
And is there a diagnosis listed in the DSM-5 on that?
There are many diagnoses listed that include psychosis, and the particular diagnosis that I arrived at was psychosis not otherwise specified, but there are a variety of other overlapping diagnoses that include psychosis.
And can you describe to the jury what that means, that diagnosis?
Yes. What it means is the person has a brain that doesn't work right. And in particular, that their brain doesn't have the ability to logically, rationally process perceptions and information, think logically and rationally in a consistent and reliable manner. A person with psychosis can drive a car and stop at a red light. They understand that's what they're supposed to do. But living a life, making the judgments you have to live a life, having relationships, obeying rules, whether you feel like obeying them or not, whether you want to obey them or not, is a separate question. People with psychosis aren't able to follow rules in a consistent manner because they don't see reality. They don't see their external environment in a consistent manner. They don't have the fundamental level of understanding that would require them to do the thing to get a task accomplished or fail to do that, or alternatively do the thing that's right to do or the thing that's not right to do. So it is a disorder of brain functioning that involves thinking, feeling, and behavior. It is something which is not brought on or caused by drugs. Drugs can also produce these conditions. When drugs produce these conditions, they're very short-lived. In his case, this is a long-standing, probably not lifelong, but certainly much of his adult life he's suffered from this disorder of thinking. These conditions are, as I said, they overlap with other diagnoses. Medically, scientifically, we really do not understand what causes a brain to manifest this illogical thinking problem, this pattern of psychosis. We know that it's involuntary. We know that people can't choose to be that way or not be that way. We know that when people are that way, they can work very hard to make better choices, and sometimes, even if they work hard to make good choices, they're not able to make good choices. We know that it confuses the information they receive from the world in a way that makes the world look very different to them than it looks to a normal person.
Now, doctor, did you review some writings that were uncovered when Mr. Loyd was arrested on these charges?
Yes, I did.
And were those writings consistent with this delusional disorder that you're talking about?
Yes, they were.
Now, did you make any observations about his childhood that were important to you? And before I get to that, were there any other impressions or diagnoses that you made in regards to Mr. Loyd besides the delusional psychotic disorder that you referenced?
Yes, there's a depression diagnosis. He's had periods of depression. There's also a post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis related to very violent and traumatic experiences that he's had in his life, beginning at least at age 13, and with an especially important episode occurring when he was about 16.
Now, let's go to the one at 13. Do you have a specialized knowledge of working with the Department of Children and Family Services?
Yes, I do.
Can you tell the jury what that is and what you do for the Department of Children and Family Services?
Yes, so the Department of Children and Family Services is the state government agency that is responsible for monitoring and intervening in a child's life when they're in danger because their parents are not able to care for them, when they're in danger because something happens in school and there isn't a proper response. They're the agency in common language that takes kids out of the home when the parents aren't treating them right. And I have done several hundred evaluations of families, which would include parents, grandparents, children, guardians, who were involved in this system. We call it the dependency system, where a child becomes dependent on the state for their care, and evaluated individuals at the request of the courts, the judge, or agencies, and then reported to the judge and the court, or the Florida Attorney General's office, the state legal authorities, and reported to courts on the issues related to adequate or inadequate parenting, psychosis, drug use, what the parent can or cannot do, what treatment they need, and whether the child can be safely maintained in the home.
Now, you became aware that there was a certain period of time that he was, him and his siblings were essentially left home alone, and he became responsible for helping raise them with his sister.
Yes.
Is that something you see within the context of DCF and some of the work you've done?
Yes.
Okay. You found out that he was drug dealing at a fairly young age, 16.
Yes.
Is that something that DCF would get involved in with a minor who was drug dealing and reported to be a drug dealer?
Absolutely, yes.
And then you found out that there, I think you had mentioned two, that the 13-year-old and the 16-year-old, where he suffered significant physical injury from being kidnapped, I think, on one occasion. And what happened when he was 13? I'm sorry.
It was I don't know if I would call it a fight. As he described to me, it wasn't much of a fight, but there was a conflict, and he was hit with a pool cue. And the history, as best I can determine it, is that he lost consciousness and was confused and briefly incoherent afterwards. There are no medical records describing that further.
And also you heard of an incident where he was taken actually to a facility where his mom checked him in and then checked him out because he didn't want to stay there. You heard of that?
Yes.
Were those things that, had DCF been involved, they may have been able to shift the focus of the help that he needed as a child to better himself?
This is absolutely a case that, in my experience, is a case that is typical of the kinds of family dynamics and adverse experiences that children and teenagers grow up with, where DCF would get involved and would consider taking the child out of the home or leaving them in the home with services or intervening in some other way.
Now, you became aware that after he got out of prison, he was robbed on 2 occasions working at the Texas Chicken by gunpoint.
Yes, I am.
Is that something you included in your impressions in regards to the trauma issue?
Yes.
Okay. So what happens when you overlap a major mental illness, as Mr. Loyd has, and trauma? What happens with the behavior, the thought process, that kind of thing, when it's enveloped? And what is it called?
Yeah. It is a terrible combination of factors where the very things that a person needs to cope with and manage deficits or symptoms or problems they have is absent because of some other independent, separate issue. So one of the things that this abnormal way of thinking does is it confuses the environment. And when the environment is confused, the person becomes anxious, they become worried, they become frightened, they become impulsive, they react to threats as if they're huge, horrible, dangerous threats rather than manageable threats. And thinking clearly about that can bring them back to a sensible pattern of behavior. Unfortunately, tragically, when a person has had an experience with violence, physical violence and trauma, they become overwhelmed with feelings of fear, and that ability to think clearly, question their own emotional reaction of fear and danger diminishes and diminishes and diminishes until they get to a condition where every stimulus in their environment, which is the slightest bit ambiguous, which is uncertain, which is threatening, is then likely to be interpreted by them, understood by them as the absolute most dangerous thing it could possibly be. So their judgment and understanding of the world is distorted.
Thank you, Doctor.
Cross?
Doctor, when you first went to see the defendant, you were not merely looking for mitigation evidence, you were looking at a more broader psychiatric status.
Yes.
You considered whether he was competent to stand trial,
Yes.
and you found that he was competent.
Yes.
You considered whether or not he was sane.
Yes.
You determined that he understands right from wrong and the nature and consequences of his actions, and he's not insane.
I need to clarify that. So insanity isn't really a word that we use in psychiatry anymore, nor is sanity. We don't call a person sane or insane. What I determined is that by the criteria of the law in the state of Florida, he did not meet the criteria for legal insanity at the time of these offenses.
And that standard is that they understand the ability to understand right from wrong and the nature and consequences of their actions.
At the time of the offense, yes.
Yes. Now, you received the results of Dr. Sesta's MMPI,
Yes, I did.
but you didn't re-administer the MMPI.
That is correct.
You accepted his results as being valid,
Yes.
and you didn't do any further testing beyond your clinical interview.
That's correct.
Again, you relied on Dr. Sesta's testing.
I relied on his administration of the MMPI. The MMPI-2 is a 567 true-false questionnaire. It's in reasonably competent professional hands, it's very easy to do it right and report the data reliably, and I did rely on that.
You had no reason to question Dr. Sesta's the reliability of the examination.
That's correct. I simply want to make it clear that I'm distinguishing the data he produced from his opinions.
I understand that. That's my next point. Although you accept his testing results, you don't necessarily have to accept his interpretation of that.
That's correct.
Now, you indicated the defendant has a delusional disorder,
Yes.
and first of all, did you eliminate the diagnosis of schizophrenia?
When I mentioned overlapping diagnoses, that's one of the things that I had in mind. Schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, manic depressive disorder, those are some overlapping diagnoses that I considered.
But did not find that to be present?
I found the more likely diagnosis to be the one that I offered, which is psychosis not otherwise specified.
Now, a delusion is different than a hallucination, correct?
Yes?
If I see little green men from space, that's a hallucination.
Let's be very careful about it. If you see little green men, that's a hallucination. If you think they're from space,
Okay.
that's a delusion.
All right.
So delusions and hallucinations are different, but we need to be careful that sometimes they interact in ways that are very close.
If I report that I see things that no one else can see, or I hear things that no one else can hear, that's a hallucination.
Yes.
Now, a delusion is a false belief about what I see and hear and experience.
Broadly speaking, yes.
But whether it's a delusion or not doesn't depend upon, let me rephrase that. There's a certain cultural aspect to whether something is a delusional, correct?
That is correct.
For example, if I came to your office and said, "Doctor, my lawn has died, my pets have died, and because my next door neighbor is a witch and she's cast a spell on me you would probably write delusional down on your notepad?
I would investigate further, but I would certainly be thinking of that, yes.
However, if you were practicing psychiatry in the 13th century in the Middle Ages and I said that, you might not write that as the delusional because that might be a commonly held belief at that time.
I have no idea what I would do in that scenario.
My point is, whether or not something's delusional or not, sometimes you have to look at the context of the person who has that thought.
Yes.
Now, the jury has heard that the defendant thought that people should not eat meat. A lot of people are vegetarians and don't eat meat.
I would agree with that.
So if I said to you, I don't eat meat, that would not cause you, that wouldn't make you think that I'm delusional based on that statement.
No, it would not.
And if I thought someone who was pregnant should not ingest certain foreign substances into their body, such as cigarette smoke or marijuana smoke, you wouldn't consider that to be a delusion either, would you?
Specifically with regard to, well, what you've just described is not a delusion,
Okay.
but it could be connected to a delusion.
But it's not itself a delusion.
Those limited facts you just described, no, that wouldn't be a delusion.
Now, doctor, how do religious beliefs and delusions intersect? For example, if I said to you, I believe the earth was created in 6 days, and science, geology, physics, everything says that's not true, would you consider that a delusion?
Not without further investigating your belief system, your background, your family, your culture.
So certain, I could believe things to be true that can't be scientifically determined to be true, aren't necessarily delusional.
That's correct.
And someone who has delusions is not necessarily psychotic, are they?
Generally speaking, yes. If a person is delusional, it is considered a form of psychosis, a symptom of psychosis.
A symptom of psychosis.
Yes.
It's not the psychosis itself.
If a person is delusional, they are going to qualify for a psychotic diagnosis. So in insurance and coding and billing, we code things, and there are thousands of codes. If a person is delusional, if they're characterized as delusional, there's going to be a code that says that's a psychotic disorder.
If I have a single delusion, does that make me psychotic?
Yes.
And you indicated that some of the defendant's thought patterns had a historical basis in truth, particularly as it revolves around race relations.
Yes.
And he had certain ideas that he was being persecuted, that the system was out to get him, that he was being falsely accused.
Yes.
Is that an uncommon belief among particularly young African American males who are in prison?
No.
When you talked to the defendant, he came to the conclusion that he professed that when he got out of prison, he wanted to live a normal life.
Yes.
Get a job, have a family,
Yes.
do the things that people do.
Yes.
Do you have an opinion as to whether or not this delusional disorder played any part in this crime?
Yes.
And does that opinion depend upon, in any degree, the manner in which this crime occurred?
Can you be a little more specific? That's a pretty broad question. I don't know that I really understand the question.
In making your decision that his mental state played a part in these murders, does it matter at all to you how the murders occurred?
Yes.
So depending on how they occurred might affect your opinion one way or the other as to whether his mental condition had an involvement in these murders?
Well, in terms of a possibility, yes. If somebody was shot from an arrow with a blimp, that's how a murder might occur. And if that were the case, then I would think of this case differently. I mean, the way you've asked the question, presumably it could be anything at all that could be different. And there are things that could be different that would affect how I would see the case.
And your view on how the case occurred is based upon what the defendant told you about what happened and what you saw in the police reports?
Those are my primary sources, yes.
Now, Mr. Lohman asked you that this is not the first time you've worked with him. In the work you do in mitigation in death penalty cases, it's primarily with defense attorneys, correct?
Yes, it is.
Thank you. I have no other questions. Your Honor.
Where you're at.
Doctor, you had talked about the delusional, whether the delusional, the context would go to the person who had that thought at the time. You mentioned something like that?
Yes.
Okay. So I want to give you a couple hypotheticals, okay? So a person who's delusional hypothetically goes to a location. At that location, there is some things that cause an enhanced amount of danger in their mind, an event. Before they get to that location, they have suffered from an enhanced amount of danger. At that location, whatever the circumstances are, they are confronted with danger. If they are a delusionally thinking person, is that going to play into your reference of whether you believe that this would have been in action, the delusion at the time?
Yes.
Okay. Explain that.
Just based on your hypothetical and not thinking about details of this case, the issue and the problem is that if a person is delusional, particularly with emphasis on the danger that he described in his hypothetical, the pattern of understanding information, of stimulus, of what you see, what you hear, what you feel emotionally, is distorted as it's received by the individual. And it's distorted to increase its dangerousness, its threat level, its power, so that the individual is dealing with a situation which to a normal person might make them a little anxious, but to a delusional person, with the emphasis on the danger that's been given here, they are terrified or frightened for their life. And that's a typical, not absolutely universal, not 100%, but very typical response to people with delusions who are dealing with dangerous circumstances.
So let's say hypothetical, somebody that you believe has a delusional disorder and post-traumatic stress, goes to the home where their girlfriend is at, gets into an argument at some point. The girlfriend goes, gets the gun, there's a confrontation, he takes away from the gun, he goes back into the yard, and he sees the brother come out, is the circumstances playing out in that process, in your belief of Markeith Loyd, and the delusional and post-traumatic stress going to be in play at that moment, before anything happens at that moment?
Absolutely, without question, it's going to be in play. It's going to be a part of his experience. It's going to be a part of his reaction. He doesn't have a choice but to function based on what his brain can do and his personal history tells him. And in that sense, it's going to be in play. It's going to be relevant to his understanding and his actions.
And so if he pulls out a gun and starts shooting, for some reason within his mind, are you going to believe that delusional disorder and the post-traumatic stress may be playing into his motivation for doing so, whether it's lawful or not lawful?
Yes.
Okay. Let's talk about insanity. What would the standard have to be for insanity to come play in that situation?
Some examples of that would be, he doesn't know that a gun shoots bullets. He thinks that a gun is shooting paint and it's going to put a paint mark on somebody. He doesn't understand that if you shoot somebody, they might die. He thinks that the people coming out of the house are literally, truly fire-breathing dragons or aliens that are going to take over the earth and kill everybody on it. Those are the kinds of rather extreme, but occasionally occurring examples that it is my belief are necessary to reach the Florida standard for insanity at the time of an offense. And I do want to emphasize that using the words sane and insane is kind of confusing, because in mental health, we don't call people sane. We don't call people insane. We're much more focused on individual diagnosis and recognizing and respecting that even if somebody has a mental health disorder, they might have other strengths. Also recognizing that if they have a mental health disorder, they may have very substantial weaknesses. We don't simply call them sane or insane. I recognize the law does that. I do that when I make conclusions related to the law, but that's the kind of extreme scenario that I would consider necessary to reach the conclusion of legal insanity in this kind of case.
And in this type of case, as was the fact in this kind of case, that was never an issue.
None of those things, nothing even approaching those things was an issue.
The issue was knowing that he committed this offense and killed his girlfriend, unborn child, and shot Ronald. Was his state of mind at that time something the jury should consider in deciding whether to send Mr. Loyd to death row? That's what this have been all about from the very beginning with me and you.
With great respect to the jury and their authority and consideration, certainly I think that's something that is part of the story and should be considered.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Doctor. You're excused.
Yes.
He's excused.
Yes.
Yeah. All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's time for a lunch break, so I need to talk to the lawyers about the schedule. We'll be back somewhere between 1:30 and 2. All right? Thanks. How long is the deposition of Dr. Pritchard going to take?
I just found out that they provided Dr. Pritchard with my client's testimony, which I do not have. So I'd ask the court to order them to provide me a copy with that, and then I can, over lunch, take his deposition.
So is depo set for lunch?
I think they said they were going to try to get him here.
We're going to propose, Mr. London, that however long he thinks the deposition is going to require, have Dr. Pritchard here, appropriate amount of time before we return, so we can do that, we can do it. already. As far as the transcript goes, we got it from real time recording. And it's available to everybody.
You talking about the PDF?
Yes. No.
Part PDF that was sent, and part of just a copy of the internet transcript of what was said, the rough copy. All of us had access to that real time. I basically copied it and pasted it and sent it.
Right, so here's the real deal, Judge. This doctor evaluated my client on Thursday. He came, we did a deposition by phone on Sunday. By Sunday, he had not reviewed some of the stuff that the state had provided. And so I said, listen, are you going to review the stuff? None of that was the defendant's statement. That wasn't brought up at all till a little while ago. So I said, I'll talk to him. He was going to review, I think, Sesta's depo and Maher's depo. And I was like, it's only going to be about 10 or 15 minutes. It's not going to be that long. Now they have given my client's statement to him, and so I need to know, number one, to what extent and what they're relying on, because I don't have access to that statement right now. That's number one. Number two, whether I have legal issues in terms of precluding them from referencing that statement in any form or fashion during the penalty phase. I obviously don't know. I've never dealt with this situation before. I don't know if there's a limitation that they're going to be allowed to talk about in regards to his opinion on that and to what extent. So I would like to have that transcript at the very least and be able to take his depo.
It's not a transcript, and I'm being picky about this because I need the record to be clear. It's not a transcript. It's the real-time court reporting PDF, the same thing everybody gets all the time. There is no transcript. A transcript is something a court reporter does and puts their seal on. That's not what exists. What exists is the PDF of the real-time court reporting, just like you got during jury selection.
Okay.
It's the exact same thing, which everybody has. Everybody gets the exact same thing.
All right.
I don't know why you don't. I mean, did you check your emails to see if you?
I know I didn't get anything from the trial judge. I stopped getting them after jury selection. So I was under the impression we weren't getting them. As a matter of fact, I had a conversation with Mrs. O'Shea about that last night, that we didn't have the trial stuff. So I was under the impression it wasn't happening.
We just sent whatever we got from Mr. Lemon and Mr. Taylor.
Okay.
All right.
So they've sent you their PDF.
I'll take his depo, and if there's an issue, I'll bring it up to the court.
So, hold on. So you guys are going to take depo now?
We can do it now. Maybe about 15, 20 minutes before my meeting here.
So then I have a question, which is this. Let's say we started back up at 2 o'clock. You're saying your witness is going to take 15 minutes?
Yeah.
How long is Dr. Pritchard going to take? Estimated guess, folks.
I would guess an hour, probably based on what all the other experts think.
All right. I have the proposed jury instructions. I also got that verdict form that you all sent me that includes all the mitigators. That came from you?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I didn't look to see who it came from. I'm trying to figure out if we can finish today and hand this off to the jury today for a verdict. That's what I'm trying to figure out. How long do you think your closing is going to be, Mr. Lenneman?
An hour and 15 minutes, I don't know.
How long is your closing going to be?
I would guess probably 30 minutes to an hour. I would ask if you, by the time we come back to 2, 3,
I prefer to do it.
5 o'clock, so we'll be through testimony and charge conversation.
Well, that's what I'm counting. That's why I'm up here calculating. I'm looking at the jury instructions to see how long they are. These don't take very long to read. Okay. All right. Go to your depo. It doesn't sound like we're going to be back in session until 2 with the witness. If there's going to be a problem, let my JA know. She'll let me know.
All right.
If for some reason this depo is going to go on far past that, let me know. And then we'll worry about charge conference after we're done with the witnesses.
So we'll do closings tomorrow?
It depends. I mean, the reason I'm hesitating is I'm not trying to start closings at 6 or anything like that, but I've had lawyers tell me that a witness is going to take an hour and then come back in the courtroom and the witness takes 10 minutes. If it's getting late in the afternoon, we'll do closings tomorrow. Okay? So, all right? All right. Court's in recess.
Thanks.